It seems the Department of Justice is taking a step backward with newly proposed emergency regulations in accordance with Senate Bill 2. That's the bill on CCWs in California. Let's talk about it. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel today. That is right, it is something we don't get to see all the time, but DOJ is taking a little bit of a step back. At least it seems that way with the new proposed regulations that they are coming out in an emergency state. Here to talk us through that, he is a partner at Michelle & Associates. He has worked on a lot of cases throughout the years. That is, of course, Matt Cabero. Matt, thanks for taking the time with us today.
Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. But before we get into that, guys, let's keep on this train. The algorithms are turning in our favor. So if you could, please like, share, and subscribe to this video and to this channel. It really helps get this message amplified out there. Hit that notification bell so that when we come out with important information like this, you can be the first to be notified so that you can have that in your arsenal. As always, we are trying to prepare as many people as possible for that November general election when they go to the ballot box. So Matt, let's just jump right into this here. Actually, let's take a step back, you and me. We have some emergency regulations that have been proposed by the Department of Justice. This, of course, is in accordance with Senate Bill 2, which we have already seen a round of emergency regulations imposed. Can you just sort of talk us through the consequences of Senate Bill 2 being passed last year and what has actually led us up to these emergency regulations being proposed?
Sure. So obviously Senate Bill 2 basically completely overhauled California's CCW issuance requirements. Most notably, of course, it got rid of good cause from a statutory perspective, which was already found unconstitutional. But also the good moral character requirement has effectively been replaced with what's called disqualifying criteria under Penal Code Section 26202. And so what you have now is basically this list of reasons why someone would be denied from a statutory perspective for a CCW. But as part of that, it completely overhauled, like I said, the application process for obtaining a CCW here in the state of California. And so DOJ, of course, was required under the statute to adopt regulations that were implementing the changes under Senate Bill 2, most notably, of course, the application itself, where it got rid of the good cause and good moral character requirements, but also made other substantial changes to things like how the issuing authorities process the applications, and of course, the training requirements associated with obtaining a CCW. And so one of the big sticking points with DOJ's original regulatory proposal, which they were adopted in January of this year, was the requirements that in order to be certified by DOJ to become an actual instructor of CCW applicants, you had to be either certified by the BSIS, the Bureau of Security and Investigative Services, or California Post as a firearms instructor and or range master, which effectively limited all CCW trainers to those two entities, which were generally not something that we saw was available to a civilian firearms instructor. It was generally something limited more towards like law enforcement and things like that. And so back in January, they adopted those regulations. And basically there was a question of how people were going to go about getting the required training. And so that's what I think led us to this recent proposal.
And that's certain. Yeah, I remember having you on to do a video about it. I remember talking to a lot of people. There was certainly an outcry from the community about the way that those regulations would be implemented. But you're right, that does bring us to here. And Jacob, I actually wanted you to, if you can, pull this up really quick. This isn't the regulations themselves, guys, but it is the finding of emergency. I just wanted to go over a couple of things that I saw in here. First of all, it starts with pursuant to the requirements of Government Code Section 11346.1. Subdivision A1, the Department of Justice is providing notice of proposed emergency adoption of regulations regarding carry concealed weapons licenses. The department finds that an emergency exists and that the immediate amendment of Sections 4410 and 4412 of Title 11, Division 5 of the California Code of Regulations is necessary to avoid serious harm to the public, peace, health and safety, and general welfare. Then you kind of go through some of these things, and they hit on programs like post CCW tactics instructor courses, CHP courses, and most notably NRA courses. The NRA courses like the law enforcement instructor, basic and personal protection outside the home instructor, and NRA certified pistol instructor. It then goes on to state, these programs are added in response to stakeholder feedback and applications submitted. CHP and CDCR are state agencies that certify firearm instructors for their own purposes. The NRA is one of the country's largest firearm training programs. As the name implies, NRA law enforcement instructors train law enforcement. The department also receives public comments that NRA basics of personal protection outside the home instructors are particularly qualified to teach the courses required by this penal code. Seeing this, obviously, it is a step backward from the original emergency regulations that took place. What is it that you actually take from all of this, and what does that kind of look like for Senate Bill 2 going forward in relation to the community and the way it can engage as CCW instructors?
Yeah, so my take on it is that initially when these regulations were first adopted back in January, there was a lot of pushback on DOJ from their basically they're limiting who can be a CCW instructor. And a lot of that pushback, I think, came from the sheriffs themselves. And so we actually heard from a lot of the sheriffs that they were told that DOJ would eventually be amending their existing regulations for this very reason. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because you have, for example, the NRA Law Enforcement Division, which certifies people to teach law enforcement. It would not surprise me if a number of DOJ's own personnel were in fact trained by NRA law enforcement instructors. And for them to go and say that those law enforcement instructors are insufficient to teach CCW holders the required course of training when their own personnel, which are actual law enforcement officers, were taught by those same people, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so I think that pushback was sufficient enough, number one. But number two, DOJ, I think, was smart enough to realize that if it was ever challenged at some point in the future, it would not look good for them to say that, those types of instructors were not sufficient to teach CCW holders. But yes, it's okay that they taught us in our daily performance of our duties, kind of thing. And so that's what I think that the real issue here was. And obviously the DOJ, of course, still went ahead with their original regulatory proposal back in January. I think they had to. And the reason they had to, of course, was for reasons like that regulatory proposal had the new application, which, people would have to fill out, things like that. So they didn't have the time, or I should say that the energy or money nonetheless to go back and revise their regulations in a quickly and timely manner to get those out in time for the implementation of SB2.
So, okay, so what you're saying is there's a lot of things within SB2 that the Department of Justice is charged with implementing. Some of them had to go forward. Some of them potentially should have been changed, but they can't just roll back all of those regulations to make those appropriate changes before implementing them all at once. So in January, they go forward with this, and this is them basically making the corrections necessary given the outcry from stakeholders or the community. I'm sort of curious. Obviously, when it comes to something like this, you would assume that the stakeholders are an important factor here. But is this a process by which we can continue rolling back some of these regulations, or is this just something specific that they received a lot of feedback on that they are now implementing the correction for, I guess?
I mean, any sort of political process you can use to help change existing regulations or roll back things that are problematic. Obviously, we're in California, so that's a very difficult order, especially if you're talking about, for example, going through the legislature to try and get the legislature to change something that the DOJ has implemented regulations on. But actually going through DOJ itself can sometimes make sense, especially if you get enough pushback. Like I said here, the stakeholders primarily are, of course, not only CCW holders, but the sheriffs themselves, the ones who actually process the applications. And so, a couple months ago, we attended the CCW conference here in California, held by Solano County. We had 57 to 58 sheriffs attend that conference. and all of their CCW units, and we're able to, walk them through the changes of SB2. And I could tell you a lot of them are not very happy with what DOJ has done. And so obviously, if they're the ones that are having to deal with this, and they go to DOJ and say, hey, you guys really need to fix this. This is why this is causing problems. Because a lot of the times DOJ doesn't either care or doesn't know what these impacts, can have on the actual issuing authorities. And so those stakeholders, of course, made enough noise here, it seems like, that actually got DOJ to sort of back off, which is good. One thing I will point out, though, about these regulations that I think is kind of flying under the radar, so to speak, is that part of this includes a financial statement from DOJ. And it looks like they're indicating, for example, that their costs on what they anticipate will be to process CCW applications are going to gradually increase over time, largely because of the increase in CCW holders. And so, of course, as part of that, guess what DOJ is doing? They're asking for more money from the legislature. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And so that's just one little tidbit that I wanted to point out on these regulations.
Well, perhaps more comments to make, which was really my next question. The first set of emergency regulations, they went through a process, right? They got proposed by the Department of Justice. They got posted on the Office of Administrative Law. There was a period where you could go in and submit a comment on those regulations. Are these going through the same process?
Yeah, so it's going to be the same process where what first has to happen is that the regulations have to get posted to a separate state agency's website called the Office of Administrative Law. Once that is actually posted on the OAL's website, that's what triggers the 5-day comment period. Because again, these are emergency regulations that DOJ is basically trying to push through as quick as possible, as opposed to the standard rulemaking process. And so as part of that, we'll be watching very closely to see when those regulations actually get posted to that website, at which point that will then trigger that 5-day comment window. So if anyone is wanting to submit comments, I'm sure we'll be looking at this carefully to see what comments we can make specifically on this particular proposal. But I will say, from a textual standpoint, what DOJ has done here is they have made it a little easier for instructors to become certified instructors in that sense. So if they can obtain the credentials that they are seeking, as far as what they're now listing, that will be a little bit easier for an individual to become a CCW certified instructor. But nonetheless, everyone that can should, of course, still submit comments, because a lot of the times, like I said, part of the reason these things are coming to light is that someone has a really good point that might not necessarily be everyone else can think of or affects them specifically. So the more people that can comment, the better.
Well, certainly. I mean, we continue to see these processes go forward. We're going to be watching them very carefully. Any final thoughts? I mean, you do overall kind of have a theme here of positivity. This looks like it's going to be good for the firearms training community and firearms and CCW holders in general. What are your final thoughts as we look forward to the comment process and the implementation of these regulations going forward?
Senate Bill 2 and its implementation by the DOJ is very fluid at the moment, and so we're seeing this as sort of one of the first changes that the Department of Justice is intending to enact here. And so, of course, it's important to make sure that your viewers and everyone is staying up to date on what's actually happening, not only from a legislative standpoint and a regulatory standpoint, but a litigation standpoint. And so, making sure that people are staying updated on what's actually happening with this. But how this actually ultimately plays out is something that will, of course, potentially subject, not only these regulations, but the statutes themselves to potential future changes. And so making sure that, you're subscribed to the CRPA for updates and legal alerts and things like that is, I think, something that everyone needs to do.
Absolutely, and we will continue to follow along, potentially have you back as this goes forward, whether it be implementation of regulations or any consequences thereafter. I know that you guys are busy at the law firm. As always, I want to thank you for your time and thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. And guys, if you like content and videos like this, please, you can help by subscribing, by sharing, and liking these videos. Hit that notification bell so that when we come out with this kind of information, you are the first to be notified so that you can be as armed as possible in understanding what's happening with some of these laws. Thanks again, guys, and we'll see you on the next one.